Welcome to this, the fourth part of our series on the Gospel of John, where we're looking at who Jesus is as revealed in John's Gospel. In today's episode, we're going to be working through two stories in chapter 2. We invite you to get your Bible and to follow along, to explore these stories with us. And today we're looking at two stories. The first one, a wedding in Cana. And then Jesus travels to Jerusalem.
Causes a bit of a fuss.
He creates an interesting backdrop to next week's episode. So, let's move into this wedding that marks the beginning of Jesus' ministry. Nazareth here is his hometown. It's where he was brought up. Cana is only 6 kilometres away on the north side. So really, you might as well say it's a suburb of Nazareth almost, but I'm sure that back in those days it was just a little bit further away. The story is couched in mystery.
John is he gives you the details that he thinks you need to have and doesn't give you anything else.
And he doesn't say what might they want to know. He's not here to satisfy our curiosity.
He's very much more concerned with, what they need to know, what the meaning of this is or what the intent behind this was. So there's a lot of these sort of things that we would be curious about that he just that's not important, moving on.
Yeah. Who got married?
I mean, there's been some speculation, but we don't really have any basis for any of it, and some of it's a little far-fetched. But, I mean, we can sort of guess that it might have been actually, either a family relative or a relation just by the role that Mary is playing, that, she has to be somehow related, not just sort of a casual guest.
She has inside knowledge on how the catering is going.
Whereas, an average guest wouldn't have that. So it kind of suggests that she is at least connected in some way to the people getting married. And there's a good chance it could be relations in some way.
A very high probability. And so she knows all the ins and outs and is keen to protect the family name. And then we have the problem that the wine ran short. A terribly embarrassing situation, but how come?
The thing is, it's not even necessarily just embarrassing. There could be legal ramifications for this. Like the way that reciprocity was practiced in these cultures, if, your hospitality didn't meet standards, that could be legal issues. It's not just kind of, that was a bit embarrassing, kind of, this stays with them for the rest of their married life.
And it could even be an embarrassment to the second and third generation. Hey, remember Fred? Yeah, that's the one where they ran out of wine. And the children could cop it at school, just knowing human nature. Now, we don't know, did they underorder? Or did somebody kick a couple of containers and we spilled a bit? We're not told.
It could even just be that they weren't a particularly well-off couple and they couldn't, there was limits to what they could actually afford to do. We don't know.
There's so much we don't know. But here we have, at the beginning of John's Gospel, Jesus' first miracle, a wedding. So perhaps we ought to talk about weddings in Jesus' day.
I think it's actually really interesting that he's chosen this place to start. Some of the other Gospels start in, the temptation in the desert or, launch him straight into ministry. Whereas here we've got a wedding right at the beginning. And I actually think John might have done that for a purpose. There's a whole bunch of, we know a little bit about the betrothal process from where it talks about Mary and Joseph being betrothed. But there's a few themes that I think come through from the wedding imagery that are actually themes that John is going to continue picking up.
So they're going to colour the whole rest of the Gospel.
For example, with the betrothal, it was generally, chosen for. So there's a degree of choice, like, the groom's parents choose his bride for him. If both of them are happy with it, her way of agreeing to the engagement was to drink a cup of blessing of some sort.
Okay, so he took a cup
and gave it to her.
He offered it to her. If she said
if she drinks it, that is like basically agreeing that, she's accepting that covenant. It is legally binding now, and they're essentially married. The only difference is they're married, they're just not living in the same space. So the relationship is already cemented there. They're just living in different houses at this point.
So that's obviously happened well before
Yes.
this event.
So at this point, we're definitely into the actual wedding part of it. We've also got the first time that they saw each other, the concept of a dowry sort of idea. There was a bride price. I think it's called a moha or something. That was given to, it's sort of the equivalent of an engagement ring or something, that was given in full and declared that, the price has been paid in full.
Okay.
Which again is a theme that John a little bit picks up on.
So this is something that the groom would say?
Yes, the groom would say the price is paid in full. Once that price has been paid, then another document is sort of negotiated and set out. Basically that the groom would provide for the needs of his bride during the waiting period before they actually got married. So as of being engaged, he was, or betrothed, he was responsible for her upkeep. And, once that was sort of signed and set, the bridegroom would declare it is finished. These are some of the things that are going to pop up later, but unless you kind of understand the context, you wouldn't necessarily see how they're linked. Once that was paid and signed, then he would make a speech of promise, which would include, I have to go, I'm going to prepare the chapar, or the bridal chamber, a place for you at my father's house, which, basically his father's house, he'd add a little bit on. And even now, there's the house and there's the add-on and there's the add-on. And
the add-on on the add-on.
And, she'd go, do not go. And he would respond, it is better for you that I go, but I will come back. And when she asked when, he'd respond, I don't know, nor the servant, only my father knows the day. Because the arrangement basically was that he would go and build and keep working on it, and it was his father who had the final call. When his father said, yep, it's ready, go get her, that was sort of, he had no idea when that was coming. It was only the father who knew. Which is, again, some imagery that we find
coming out in the Gospels.
That they had a little bit of time together, but then he went away for a while to build. There's sort of imagery that there's a degree of cleansing, of purification that happens in a wedding, that there's some ritual covenant washing that happens beforehand, but you've also got some commentators have sort of commented that there was a representation of, being cleansed from sins in part of this marriage process. And both of them go through that. You've got, while he's building, the bride is waiting and wearing a veil with a headband that has the coins from the bride price, just sort of, showing that she belongs to the groom. She isn't available anymore. And she works on just sort of preparing herself for marriage, essentially. When the father of the groom decided that, everything is ready, go get her, the least expected moment of the night. So it's, middle of the night. A trumpet would sound, and I think it's the groomsman would run ahead of the groom sounding the shofar. Kind of, the groom is coming, the groom is coming. He'd see in the distance where his bride was waiting for him with the burning oil lamp. And then, find her and take her to the father's house. And, all of this has sort of come together before we get to this point, because this is sort of the point that, they're now at the feasting together, celebrating the marriage kind of moment. But you've kind of got this layering of the marriage covenant concept being kind of giving you some of the imagery that is going to come up in how John describes and defines the relationship going forward between God and his people.
So it's just a small picture of something much
And I
bigger.
think we see it in the temple sacrifice system, that, there's types in there that point forward to this, but we don't necessarily see it as clearly in the marriage system unless we kind of do some digging.
Well, thank you for doing that little bit of digging. That was fascinating. So we come into John chapter 2, and on the third day,
there are some suggestions this could have been like the third day from meeting them, because the walk from it could have been a little bit of a walk to get to Cana.
Yes.
From where they were.
And what we know is that Nathanael came from Cana.
Nathanael was from Cana.
John's gospel a little bit further on is going to
let us know that.
Give us that little detail. And there is a wedding. The mother of Jesus is there.
Which, again, it suggests that there's a relationship.
In fact, somewhere. A little bit later on, we'll find that his brothers may well have been there as well. And Jesus was invited, and his disciples were invited along with him.
Whether this was kind of a last-minute hospitality thing, or I'm suggesting that at least some of these people, if Nathanael is local to Cana, there's a good chance he would have been invited anyway. Mm-hmm. And if Jesus is coming through and his mother and brother's already there, it's not just a casual, while you're popping by, you may as well stop, that there may have been a couple of extra, but I don't think that this was a massive extra drain on the resources of the feast.
Wedding. But we come to the point where the wine is deficient, is the way the literal translation puts it. The wine was running out. And this is a serious crisis of hospitality. The wedding celebration could go on for a week, and we don't know what day we're up to.
Yes. I would think it's probably not the first day or so, but we don't know.
We would certainly hope that, that catering hadn't made such a oversight. But Jesus' mother obviously knows what's going on and sidles up to him and says, "They have no wine." And Jesus says to her, "What to me and you, woman? My hour is not yet come."
Which is slightly clumsy English, but I think there's a really gentle challenge in here. Mm-hmm. That, the preconceived notion she's coming with need to be sort of played around with a little bit, that she has an idea that he needs, he has to be about his father's business, and that's not always going to include what his mum wants him to do. Mm-hmm. The term woman for us would, what is it to you, woman? For us, that would be a little bit more derogatory. In this context,
certainly in Australian context,
yes.
Hey, woman, fetch my newspaper. Hey, woman, bring my slippers.
And it'd be really easy to read it in that context. Mm-hmm. But all the times that we see Jesus using it, there's no hint of him using it in that way.
In fact, just when we look at the times that he uses it, here at the wedding, his mother, can you imagine what her mental state is if she's part of the intimate planning for this wedding?
And something so drastic has gone so vastly wrong.
She, mothers of the bride are in an emotion. This is an emotional time. It's important. She's fragile. And Jesus speaks to her like this. In a couple of chapters' time, when he comes to the woman of Samaria at the well, here's a woman who's gone through 5 marriages. Mm-hmm. And the one she's with isn't. She's
in a fairly vulnerable place.
She's vulnerable. She's fragile. And Jesus speaks to her as woman. In chapter 8, we've got the woman caught in adultery. Mm-hmm. and all the religious authorities wanting to stone her. Again, she is in a vulnerable, fragile position. His mother at the cross, where he says to John, take her, look after her.
This is your mother.
Woman, this is your son. And then Mary Magdalene at the tomb, and it's empty. Jesus has first been killed and now the body's vanished.
Mary Magdalene's in a little bit of a mess.
And so I think we need to read it as a very kindly
and a gentle
expression that we could easily misunderstand in 21st century Australian culture. But then he reminds her, my hour is not yet come.
Which is, like, John has a particular focus on time. Like, more than any of the other Gospels, he gives us, next day, or like he'll give us orientation within time. But he's also sort of specifically concerned, with his hour had not yet come is one of the phrases that he uses a bit. And you've kind of got this not yet come, not yet come, not yet come. And then you get to this point where, his hour comes.
And so Jesus, it seems, from the beginning has this sense of time and of what he's there to accomplish.
And it's almost an outside view, like looking at it from an outsider's view of time rather than a being in it, that he can sort of see almost the whole timeline and understand how it works.
And we're going to see that in both of these stories that we're looking at today. So in John chapter 7, they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour was not yet come. And in chapter 8, he's upset some people. These words he spoke in the treasury as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come.
Which is kind of fascinating, really, because you've got him going around, at least from their perspective, essentially causing trouble. And yet, because his hour had not yet come, nothing happens.
And then in John chapter 12,
it sort of resolves this theme just a little bit.
What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour, but for this purpose I have come to this hour. Father, glorify your name. And a voice came from heaven, I have glorified it and I will glorify it again. And if you're watching this passage, just notice that word glorify while we're going through. We'll come back to that a little bit later on.
But it is a theme that continues.
It's a theme that we've already met, and it's going to flow through John. Again, in chapter 13, Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples at another Passover.
So you've kind of got this 12 and 13, like this area is where the hour comes. And often we kind of think of, that it doesn't come until the cross, but essentially the hour of, it comes when he makes that decision to go through with it, really.
And so before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come to depart out of this world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. It's almost like the hour in the divine romance. A few chapters further on, and it's the same evening. That dialogue, he said to the disciples, I'm going to go away. I'm going to my Father's house. I'm going to prepare a place for you. All language that...
And we have a lot of there was a lot packed into that evening.
And then he talks and talks and talks.
Spending some precious time together.
When he had spoken these words, he lifted up his eyes to heaven and said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you.
And I think that this link between, the hour of coming and glorification, there are definitely connections there that we're going to see.
And so the hour is not yet come in glory. certainly link us back to this wedding story. So Jesus' mother, having got a little bit of a, look, my hour is not yet come.
Persists.
This is not the only time Jesus does this. There was a woman from Syrophoenicia who came to Jesus in one of the Gospels. And Jesus gave her a little bit of a hard time, someone might say. But she persisted. And Mary clearly knows what she wants. And this is a real expression of faith. Yeah? She just turns to the servants and says, whatever he says, do it.
Which indicates, like we've talked before, that she's intimate with the workings of the catering here, but she also, she has the ability to tell the servants that, whatever he says, do it. It's not just a random guest walking up. She's connected here. But there's just kind of, like, Jesus never says no here. He never says, I will do it. He never says, I won't do it. He just sort of gently reminds her of his purpose. And I don't think he would have just sort of sat back and like, you didn't plan properly, this will be fun to watch. Like, that's not the kind of person he is.
Yeah, your lack of planning is not my emergency.
Yes.
There's no necessity here. It's very clear Mary doesn't want her family to suffer. She personally can't do anything, but she believes she knows someone who can.
And even if she doesn't specifically know what she wants that to look like, it's just there is a problem here and I think you can do something about it.
And she tells the servants, just do what he tells you. You may not understand, just do it.
And I mean, this is going to take a degree of faith on their part as well, because you don't serve water to the master. You just don't.
So, there were 6 stone jars standing there according to the purification of the Jews, having space for about 2 or 3 metritae. And Jesus says to them, fill the jars with water.
I find it interesting that filled it up to the brim. It's not just sort of, more or less. There's an abundance here that it's kind of right at the top.
Now, I have a feeling that you may have seen a lot of artist pictures of these jars. Little jars, clay jars that have been baked that carry a bit of water.
A metritae is about 39.5 litres. About.
So 2 to 3 metritae is somewhere between 75 to 115 litres.
And that's each jar.
So this is going to take a bit of work. Yes. You are not going to pick these stone jars up. And these are actually stone jars at Cana. And there are others in the Holy Land. You are not going to pick these up and carry them to the well.
No.
There is going to be a whole lot of work involved in going to the well, pulling it up, walking back, fill it up, go back, get some more.
And, with the undercurrent of, things are going wrong, we've run out of wine, there's an urgency.
Do you sense that the servants may also be stressed about this?
Well, the well-being of their family is going to reflect on their ability to be cared for and have a place as well.
So it's interesting to think about how much capacity we actually have there. Some of you will know them as 200-litre drums. Others of you will call them 44-gallon drums. It's the same size. Between 2 and 3 of them.
Looking at somewhere between 450 litres and 690 litres. That's a lot of wine.
Well, it's a lot of water to start with.
Yes.
And they have done what Jesus said, and they're now waiting for him to add the wine powder. And he doesn't. All he says is, well, fill a cup and
Take it out.
take it to the master of the feast. And they did.
I think that has to have taken a huge amount of faith on their part.
But this is John's whole point. I'm writing these things so that you may believe, and the believing you may have life in his name.
And I think there's part of the thing with this is that it is actually really secret. 98% of the guests would have had no idea there was any issue.
That's how it should be with a wedding.
That's how it should be. But you've got, Jesus knew, his mother basically knew, the servants knew. And assumedly the disciples either found out at this point or at a later point. We don't know which.
And we do know that Mary went and lived with John. And whether she filled him in or whether John...
I mean, we're pretty sure that John was there himself. It's just sort of what degree of he knew. The disciples might have been hanging around Jesus when he was talking to the servants. We don't know. But you've got a very small number of people who even know that this happened. And John takes pains to sort of kind of point out that, the master of the feast had no idea, but the servants knew. And I wonder if there's a degree to which John is kind of pointing at this idea, because we end up here with the disciples believing, whether this is the servants going, we know, we've seen.
Well, for all I know, they had drawn out water. And
us in our Western scientific kind of, how did when did it change? Was it when you took it out of the here? Was it when you poured it into at what point did it, how? And but that isn't what we're concerned with here.
And the master of the feast is just totally impressed. And he calls the bridegroom, who had the responsibility for providing.
And may not actually have known any of this.
Why worry the newlyweds? But the master of the feast says, look, everybody sets out the good wine first, and then when people have had a little bit, then the inferior, the cheaper stuff can be fed into the system. And you have kept the best to wine. There's almost a luxury and abundance here.
At this point, they're not going to their taste is going to be a little bit more dull. They've been drinking for a little bit. It would be really easy just to kind of, like they do, bring out the less good wine when people aren't really, but bringing out the really, really good stuff, even when people can't maybe appreciate it for exactly what it is.
And this is new wine.
This is new wine that is better. You've kind of got Jesus making the groom look good. He never sort of steps up and if the groom hasn't actually been informed that there was a problem, this is going to be a bit bewildering to him. But it's just going to be one of those, that's different, but okay. It's a big day. There's lots of things happen, but sometimes it can feel a bit like a bait and switch. You put the good stuff out and then you kind of lure people in with the good stuff. And when they're in, you kind of well, here's the actual normal stuff. Whereas Jesus has this kind of saving the best to last sort of thing. That you don't kind of get this big showy thing to get you in and then it's all downhill from there. It's the good stuff is yet to come.
And that's an interesting thought, the best. We're only getting started.
Yes, this is literally the first thing.
And it's like Jesus said at the end of last week's episode, that you'll see much more than this. And this is just the beginning of it. In Western tradition, the scientific thing, how did you do that?
When did it change? Did they pull it out as water and pour it? Did it change in the pouring? Did it change in the jug?
But Eastern thought is different. And it doesn't say how, it asks why. Why would you do that? There must be a purpose for it, beyond just saving the face for the groom.
And I kind of feel like some of it is John is leaving you to kind of mull over it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Like we do get a little bit, but I think he's predominant. There's part of it that's just like, here's a story, think on that for a bit.
Certainly this is not something that just everybody can do. Like Mary didn't go to the servants and say, well, look, you better dig up some wines if you can go down to the supermarket and pick some up. So it's almost a signal that here in their midst is one who has this creative power. The one who in the beginning said, let there be, and there was.
And in this point, he doesn't say anything. There's no magic word. There's no kind of
waving
touch.
of the hand.
It's just kind of, here are your instructions, carry them out and everything will be okay.
And they believed him, or believed Mary, and they did what they were asked. There's almost a sense also that the kingdom of heaven is like a wedding, a place of fullness, a place of abundance. This idea of God providing has happened multiple times through history.
It's kind of been one of the key things that has been the marker of that relationship all the way through.
When God brought Israel out of Egypt, there was the manna, there was the water. The story of Elijah. And God sent a bird with something for him to eat. And Elisha, the woman who all she had was a little bit of oil, God made that little bit go a long way.
And there are some slight differences here in that in most of those cases, that was about here is enough to survive. That, it wasn't necessarily about extravagance, but you were provided for and solidly provided for, whereas here there's an extravagance. Like, it causes all sorts of problems, it's embarrassing and whatnot, but nobody's probably going to die without this happening.
But in a small way, they are saved from a social fate that maybe is worse than starvation.
And I think there's a degree of you get a sense of Jesus caring for people from here. Like, again, it's almost done a little bit by remote control, so you don't necessarily see it explicitly because he kind of just gives them instructions and it happens. But kind of looking between the layers a little bit, you're starting to get Jesus sort of seeing need and being there for people when they needed it.
So here's a story of people where the wine has run out, there is no wine, and Jesus provides them not just with something to drink, but something really good, provides them with the very best. I did a little search on the word wine, and the next time that it comes up in John's Gospel is when Jesus is on the cross, where he's almost taking the bad end of things on humanity's part.
And one of the things that it is actually important to note here is that it's probably a slightly different wine in that what we understand as wine has a much higher alcohol content than back then. Like, it's not to say that back then there was none, but it was much, much lower. Like, you could get drunk on it, but you have to drink an awful lot to be able to do so. Whereas the wine that he was off on the cross seems to be a little bit more of a pain relief kind of arrangement.
But it didn't taste very good.
No. But, if somebody is being nailed to a cross like that, probably their comfort value isn't a high priority to you.
And verse 11 at this point just says, look, this is the beginning. This is just the beginning of the signs, multiple signs that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee.
You've almost got a marking here. Like, we end the previous chapter with, there's a lot more to come. And here it's sort of, okay, so this is the beginning. This is the starting line. Another thing, when Matthew talks about it, he talks about it as miracles. John more uses the concept of signs, which is still miracles, but it's more that it's given sort of to confirm and corroborate, authenticate almost, that it's not just sort of he went around doing good stuff. It's these dots connect.
So in the previous chapter, the disciples had followed him, but now he's giving them reasons to believe.
And there's this concept of believed in him, there's almost in the Greek more of an into him, like it's a kind of becoming more and more absorbed into that way of thinking in life, that, believing in him was not just I believe done, that it was a growth thing.
And it's bigger than, I believe, what he said on this occasion. It's they actually believed in him as a person.
Who he is.
And it's interesting, we also have that he revealed his glory.
We've got it just sort of dripping through the gospel.
So glory is something that we will want to focus on before we come to the end of John's gospel. We'll just put it out there for you to mull over when you can't sleep at night, or, what is this glory that is repeatedly being referred to in this gospel? At this point, they travel. Jesus, his disciples, his mother, his brothers, travel from Cana up to Capernaum on the banks or the shores of the Sea of Galilee.
Which is a fair walk, really, particularly considering the size of group they have.
It's about 25 kilometres in a straight line.
And they wouldn't have been walking a straight line.
I don't believe they walked in a straight line. And they stayed there not many days. So we have a short journey. And then...
There are some indications, actually, in, I think, Matthew 4, we get a slight indication that Jesus may have spent at some point had a base in Capernaum. That, that's the direction he headed when he kind of needed to lie low, through Cana and Capernaum. But in Matthew 4, we do get an indication that Jesus was living there for a little while.
It was certainly Peter's hometown.
And that we've got... him, his mother, his brothers, his disciples. This isn't just, this is either, going to someone's place or a direct offer of hospitality. It's not just going for a joy walk kind of thing.
And they spend some time there.
Yeah.
But the season,
not many days.
The season is changing. The Passover of the Jews is near. And Jesus went up to Jerusalem.
They've started up here.
And then he worked his way down the Jordan Valley.
And then across to Jerusalem.
So
we've got Nazareth here, and Cana's sort of in here. So they've come Nazareth, Cana, up to here. And that's, if you're going to have to go here soon, going up here is an unusual. Because this is a long.
And that's going along lower than sea level. It's the long way round.
But to go this way is the way of less resistance. They're not having to go through Samaria. They come back through Samaria soon.
In chapter 4, we're going to come back up through, and you can see, I think, Nablus.
Yeah, in here.
So that's where he meets the Samaritan woman in chapter 4.
And because John is a little bit more concerned with location, we sort of get this revolving around Jerusalem. None of the other Gospels mention anything more than one Passover, whereas he's got 3 Passovers. You've kind of got this moving, but it's sort of Jerusalem's at the centre. It keeps coming back to Jerusalem, going elsewhere, coming back to Jerusalem. And in this case, we sort of had this movement that, he's done that, come down to Jerusalem, and then he's heading back, but he's not heading back via this way.
And it's Passover time. We're not going to stop too much to talk about Passover story here. We will in a future episode.
We have a couple of Passovers to go yet.
We've got a number of Passovers to go. We can't fit everything into one. But it is a reminder of the time that they had a salvation event. They had to kill and eat a lamb to remind themselves of it. John's just introduced us, behold the Lamb of God. But when Jesus gets to Jerusalem, there's a problem.
And the other thing I think it's interesting to note here is that we don't actually get to the Passover yet. Is that, the Passover of the Jews was near. So we're still in the preparation phase. And one of the aspects of preparation was a cleansing.
You cleaned your house, you got rid of all the yeast. But in Jerusalem, a real problem is not in the houses of the people.
No.
It's in the house of God. Because he found in the house of God, in the temple, those selling oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers sitting. The place of worship has become a regular marketplace.
And I think, it all essentially happened in the Gentile court, which meant that, anybody who was Gentile literally had no place to go to pray. You couldn't.
You came there and it was a centre of commerce.
And they'd spend a lot of time trying to get a lot better at following the law, rather than better ways of following, where God had his focus. So one of the reasons that you had to have the money changers initially was that you weren't supposed to have graven images, so coins from other places that had, emperors or whatever that were, that was a graven image. You couldn't use that, so you'd have to get your money changed.
And it inflated.
Of course. And so, selling things for sacrifice and stuff, well, if yours isn't quite perfect, then you can come and, this kind of, and it'd become a place of exploitation and commercial interest.
The inspector will make sure that yours has got an imperfection.
And it's kind of highlighting these religious ordinances over, what was actually supposed to be a place of prayer and experience of, coming to the temple and having communion with God was a marketplace. A marketplace set up to exploit
the worshippers.
Particularly
Gentiles and people who had come from afar.
Because you've got the priests who know what is going on clearly. And
the high priest most of all.
Yes. And, there's fees for having a booth here. Now, yes, there are, some of the money in the temple can be used to help people, loan to poorer people so that they can get their, make their payments and not get But again, that's sort of feeding into this empire.
And just making religion a thing of exploitation rather than serving and blessing. And yes, there did need to be a place to purchase a lamb for the Passover. And it would have been a very busy market the day that Jesus walked in there, in the period just leading up to Passover. Everybody wanted a lamb. Lamb's a premium.
But when you've sort of made it kind of a one-stop shop that, everything is here, you don't have to go anywhere else, just come and give money to all of these people and everything will be fine.
And we will fail any lamb you buy elsewhere.
And there's kind of, commercial interest takes a front seat and the sort of, pushes it into spiritual indifference almost, that it's going through the motions and it's doing the things, but it's lost its focus.
And nobody was stopping and asking the question, is this the right thing to do? Undoubtedly, from the reaction we see further down from the ordinary people, they are not happy with how they're being treated.
And what he does is liberating for them. As far as, the chief priests and the religious leaders, this is a problem. This is a revolutionary upstart who's going to, go on to be a major issue. But for the normal people, this is somebody who is liberating them.
And, from reading the Gospels, it seems like, you've got the sheep gate. There had been the sheep markets down near the pool of Bethesda. But there may have been, in times past, a place outside of the temple where you could go and...
But outside of the temple, you can't have the financial kickbacks for renting booth space to people.
It sort of leads you to stop and say, are there things that if Jesus was to come to a church today, he would look at and hunt some things?
And there's levels of that. There's a local church, but, on a global level, if we're looking at the influence that Christianity has and the way that the Christian culture, subcultures tend to work, I kind of feel like there'd be some tables being turned over
There's certainly some places where there's attitudes of oppression that need to be examined
and that are supposedly being upheld by religious reasons. That, it's in this case, what they were trying to make it look like they were doing with, finding better and better ways of following the law. Making sure that, this is almost perfect, but it could be more perfect. So you have to get a more perfect one, or you have to get the right, making it, adding more and more to the law to make it onerous.
So it's legal abuse. It's legal, but it's abuse.
And there's nothing they could do about it. Because, if you don't do this, then that's a major thing. You can't not engage.
Because you have to sacrifice your lamb at the temple to have a lamb for Passover.
And if they don't accept your lamb, then there's nothing.
They have you over a barrel. And it's an ugly picture of God. And so Jesus makes a whip of cords. Now, whether these are the cords that were used to lead lambs around, I don't know.
What I do find interesting here, though, is that we think this is a different one to the ones mentioned in the other Gospels who have a cleansing at the end. And there's a good suggestion that he probably did have to do it twice, that it wouldn't take long for it to go back to the way it was. But none of the others actually mention a whip of cords. By sitting down and making a whip of cords, this isn't just kind of he walked in and lost his temper. There's a degree of premeditation here. Like he sits down and he makes a whip of cords and then gets in.
And it's not what he did, but it's what their brains told him he might do. And he drove out from the temple both sheep and oxen.
That's going to be chaos.
It is going to be chaos. He goes to the money changers and he just tips the tables over. He doesn't appropriate the money. They can pick it up. To those selling doves, he doesn't let the doves go. I know all the pictures in the books have him letting the doves go. He simply said, take these things away from here. Get out. The miracle of it is nobody lifted a finger.
I know. You've got this guy who's basically come in and just completely overturning the economic system, that microsystem that's built up in here, and no one touches him. They don't even sort of, oi, stop. Like, they come and ask some questions. But I don't know, if somebody kind of walked into here and started kind of, knocking over pews and stuff, I would kind of imagine there'd be a little bit, maybe don't do that.
They'd be reaching for the mobile phone and ringing 000.
And yet there's nothing.
There's nothing. And then he says, do not make my Father's house a house of trade.
Which is a bit of a punch, really, because my father, this is the first time he refers to it as my father. And that is not lost on them. That irks them.
He is making a claim when he says, this is my Father's house.
And there's it's making a claim to, being able to speak on behalf, which is, again, it's not just that it's his Father's house, it's that he has the right to do this.
And to speak and to say, get this out of here. Maybe the suddenness of it's a little bit of a shock to their sensibilities, but everybody goes.
I think it can be a bit of a shock to our sensibilities too, though. In that, if we're not paying a lot of attention, sometimes the, gentle Jesus, meek and mild is the idea you get. That he just went around being nice and healing people. And we very clearly get a Jesus here who's not a create no disturbances kind of faith. He is making a holy ruckus.
And while he's upsetting some people, he's also bringing some freedom to some people.
And there's a sense of, I think there is still love in this, but it's a fierce protective love. There is injustice, get away from my babies kind of thing. It's just, that he's been coming here for years. He's no doubt been looking around feeling kind of a bit uncomfortable about it.
So since he was 12, he's been coming here, probably felt uncomfortable each time.
And at this point, it's just no, this is enough. And,
Somebody has to do something about this, and my time has come.
And I kind of wonder, like initially for the disciples, it might have been a little bit, oh my goodness, what's he doing? What's he doing? We're going to get thrown out, But I think they would have figured out reasonably quickly what he was about. Mm-hmm. But that sense that sometimes you have to get in and make a mess and make a noise and, do the uncomfortable, making people uncomfortable is a holy and important thing. Mm-hmm. It's not, sometimes we get the idea that you have to be polite and nice and kind of not make a fuss. If change needs to happen, you do it the proper ways and you go around and you make sure that you still stay polite and not, whereas Jesus doesn't do that. He's like, there is injustice, and if you just sort of try and lobby the chief priest, nothing's going to change. And that sometimes you actually have to get in there and uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. And be willing to make people uncomfortable.
And it almost seems like this might be a messianic thing as well. Because when we come to Malachi, or go back to Malachi, in chapter 3, behold, I send my messenger and he will prepare the way before me. Now that's almost like John the Baptist that we heard. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. And the messenger of the covenant in whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? Who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire, like fuller's soap. He will sit like a refiner and a purifier of silver. And he will purify the sons of Levi, the priests, the people involved in the temple services.
And I think there's this temptation that, when they were looking to the Messiah, they were seeing somebody who was going to free them from the Roman oppression. Mm-hmm. It was very much it's their fault. Like, when the Messiah comes, he's going to free us from them and then everything's going to be great. It wasn't we might be the problem.
We might be the oppressor.
And I think that there needs to be a bit of a check in that. Like, are we actually involved and complicit here? Because they completely did not believe they were. And yet, he doesn't rip into the foreigners. He doesn't, take on the pagan way of living. The first thing he rips into is the temple.
And here we have almost, if this verse is indeed messianic, here is God coming to his temple. And that's not inconsistent with, in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. Here he has showed up, not satisfied with what he's seeing.
And you've got, I think, a bit of a parenthesis from John here that, his disciples remembered that it is written, the zeal of your house will consume me. I don't think they were sitting there watching the chaos going, actually, I remember that checks out. I think it was afterwards sitting there going, what just happened? And, having taken some time to reflect going, oh, okay, that, I see connections here. But the zeal of your house will consume me. I kind of wonder, what would that look like for us? What would it look like to be consumed with zeal for the house of God? Because I don't think it's necessarily the way you would initially kind of, the upkeep of, the premises and whatever. What does it mean to be consumed with the zeal of God's house?
It's going to involve God's name, God's worship,
the way
God's reputation.
Yeah, the character that is revealed.
And their response? What sign do you show us that you do these things? He's already done them.
And I think, we're looking at signs in terms of, miracles, but given to essentially, authenticate and corroborate. Basically, they're asking him, are you authorized to do this? We're not, he's marched in and done it as though he is. And so they're sort of, he might be, we need to kind of tread carefully here, but.
And if he worked a sign, would they believe it?
No. Because, even if he is, this isn't the kind of person they want. It's not fitting their agenda. So they're always going to be looking for reasons to but he's not this. So
God gives us enough evidence to believe, but he doesn't remove the possibility of doubt if we want to doubt.
And I think the other thing, the way Jesus does stuff like this, the way he responds to a lot of people doesn't seem like he's answering the question, but he's still teaching some. It might take some others a little bit longer to catch on to what he was actually on about, and we get that in a moment here. But there are still people who are learning things from this, even if the chief teachers don't actually understand what is going on.
There are other ears listening.
Yes.
And so Jesus answers them. He says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up.
That got him going.
In fact, that word destroy there, it's a verb, second person plural. It's you destroy this temple. It's as if he's not saying I'm going to. It's you destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up.
We're sort of getting to the beginning of Jesus being a little cryptic.
It is. He's planting a bomb here, just putting it inside their heads. They are going to bring this up. He said he was going to destroy the temple.
And they will try and use this later when they're trying to come up with reasons to convict him. Now, nobody can get their story straight, but they will sort of use this.
So they wouldn't be convinced by a sign, he says. Let them wait. And just puts the grenade in their heads, and in 3 years or so, it's going to go kaboom. Oh, now we know what he was talking about.
And even the disciples, John again gives us one of those little sort of, by the way, explanation things that, even they, I think, would have been sitting there going, I don't follow, but I'm okay. It indicates that, when they remembered this and kind of put the bits together that, and they believed the scripture and the word that he'd spoken even more.
Interesting about Jesus, it's evidence that right here at the beginning of his ministry, he had clear foresight.
Of where it was going and
of what it was about, where it was going to take him. Right from the beginning. It's not like it developed later. The Jews said, this temple took 46 years to build, and you will raise it up in 3 days? Yeah? It's clear Jesus is talking figuratively, but they are reading it literally.
And this actually happens a lot with Jesus' teaching, but again, it's sort of coming back to that thing we talked about in the week one a little bit, just the above and below, and that he's trying to pull them into above thinking, and they're stuck in below. They're sort of looking at the literal going, but this took 46 years to build. How are you going to do that in a weekend?
And it's a danger also in reading the Bible that you get stuck into literal when it's actually wanting to take you further than literal.
And I think, the literal can clearly inform the figurative, but we have to sort of understand that there are layers here. And this is one of the particular times where, there are layers that, the temple was designed to be God with us. That was where God lived. That was, how God made his dwelling among people. So we're now taking that temple and God is literally in person tabernacling with us. He is now among us.
Okay, so the word became flesh and templed among us.
So when he's talking here about the temple, he's not just sort of using some vague figurative connection. He is literally God with us, which is what the temple was.
The temple.
Yes. And John sort of made a note here that the disciples did eventually figure that out, but...
Yeah, he was speaking concerning the temple of his body. Therefore, when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remember that he had said this. Sometimes it's good to hear now, and the impact will come later.
And John is one of the ones who's very much concerned with this, that, if there's a sort of this happened, it was a bit odd at the time, but, we've put the bits together now and we've figured it out, he will give you that note.
And it's good to hear now with respect to time to come. Because the disciples, these words came back. And probably for many of the temple people too, because a lot of the priests ended up believing as well. And the impact of this event on the disciples, they remembered that he'd said this, and they believed the scripture.
And you've got this sort of continual, we tend to think of, belief as a milestone. That, believing and then, from then on it's, whereas this is believing more and more almost. And the fact that, they can be sitting there, maybe a year or so even in the future and believing more because of things that happened that they're remembering. That there's, some of this is sort of sleeper stuff, that it will grow faith even past the time that this is happening.
That faith is not the absence of evidence. That the more evidence we have, the more faith we will have.
And that they had a degree of faith even before they figured it out. But sometimes I think you can get caught up on the imagery of temple. Sometimes even in the health movement, that idea of, being a temple. We can miss some of this imagery in that, if we are being living representations of God here on earth, then that has implications on the choices we make about how everything. But you miss that implication if you're missing this link between, Jesus going, I am the temple.
So they believed the scripture and they believed the words that Jesus had spoken. So what's the picture of Jesus? What are we learning about who Jesus is? What does this contribute to what we've already seen? In our first episode, we saw him as the Word, eternal God, the Creator, almost out there somewhere. Life, light, became flesh, full of grace. Oh, wow, some grace today. The only begotten God. In the second episode, we looked at him as the Lamb of God. That's touching today as well. The one taking away the sin of the world, Son of God, Messiah, almost that claim today, spoken of by Moses, King of Israel. And in this episode, it's almost God with us at our everyday things like wedding feasts. God bringing abundant life at low points. Here he is as God with a love for the hurting. Here he is as the Lord coming to the temple and the temple itself. God with us, wanting what is best for us and wanting to clean up the mess that's in our world. At this point, we're going to take a break because we think that the next section actually starts in verse 23.
Leads nicely into John 3.
And feeds nicely into the next chapter. So do keep reading with us and ahead of us. We hope that you'll find a whole lot of blessing and benefit as you do that.
And do feel free to, we've got links if you want to print out and make lots of scribbles and stuff like I've done.
And like I've done. Please study along with us. You'll get so much more out of it if you're actually reading it for yourself.
And there's levels, yes, read and read and read, but sometimes reading with a pencil and, being able to colour things and highlight things and go put question marks and stuff.
And you've got so many more notes in your columns.
But sometimes the act of doing it with a pencil just makes your brain ask more questions and think through things in a different way than just kind of almost passively reading.
We also do have a Facebook page called Working the Word. You'll be able to find that by searching for it. It's got the same logo. Or you can find a link to it on the website for the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Lithgow, Oberon or Mudgee.
And we sometimes pop interesting resources or links or what we're working on up there.
And if you see things that we haven't seen, and we hope that you will.
Yes.
because this is how we learn.
And this is by no means comprehensive. Like there is a lot more to pick out of this than we can find.
So please feel welcome to go there, to interact with all of us who are on that page, and stay with us. Let's keep working the word together, and we'll see you in the next episode.